Hi, I'm Helen Bauer, and this is the Heart of Hospice Podcast. The Heart of Hospice Podcast is your source for compassionate and informative discussions about hospice and end-of-life care. I'm a certified hospice and palliative care nurse with over 15 years of experience. Whether you're a caregiver, someone with a serious illness, or you simply need to know more about hospice care, this podcast is for you. Join me as we explore all the aspects of hospice, from the details of caregiving to the emotional and spiritual dimensions of end-of-life journeys. For more resources and to connect with me, visit theheartofhospice.com and find us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Keep listening for today's episode.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
This episode of The Heart of Hospice is being sponsored by Care Boss, the latest book by Jennifer O'Brien. Care Boss is the book that reminds family caregivers that they are the CEO of their loved one's care. Jennifer has served in healthcare leadership for over 35 years and was also the personal caregiver for her parents and her husband. Care Boss is written to empower caregivers, but it's more than just a book. It's a workbook and organizational tool as well. Check it out at jenniferaobrien.com.
Gabby Jimenez of the Hospice Heart is back with me today to talk about hospice myths and misconceptions and how they get in the way of good end-of-life care. Gabby, or Gabrielle Elise Jimenez, is a hospice nurse, an author, an end-of-life doula, and a death and dying educator. Her website and Facebook page, both named The Hospice Heart, offer support for people who are either terminally ill or caring for someone who is nearing the end of life. Gabby has learned from being at the bedside of about 2,000 people who have taken their last breath. Her end-of-life doula training has helped her to truly understand the sacredness of death and dying and what it means to be fully present for someone during that intimate and final moment. You can find her information and everything that she offers on her website, thehospiceheart.net. Gabby and I started off this episode with a side conversation about advanced care planning that you'll want to hear. You're going to hear us disclose some details about our own advanced care plans. There are a lot of myths surrounding hospice care, and Gabby and I in this conversation were busting those myths right and left. We were talking about morphine. You're going to hear us talk about when to start hospice, do not resuscitate orders, and more. So get comfortable. This is a great hospice conversation. There's a lot to learn. My friend Gabby Jimenez, welcome back to the Heart of Hospice Podcast.
Thank you for having me. We've been doing this for so long now. I think we're like once a year practically.
Maybe more than that. Maybe we should make it more than that.
We should make it more than that.
We should. Sounds like a plan that we can get started. I'm so glad to have you back on the show because today we're talking about one of my favorite topics, and I know that you share my enthusiasm and passion and a little bit of outrage for myth busting when it comes to hospice and end-of-life care. And that's what we're talking about today.
Well, it's a good topic because I think if we could calm some of the myths and misconceptions, maybe we could reduce fear.
I agree. Well, to get us started, I have an icebreaker question that I picked from the End of Life deck.
Okay, I'm ready.
So this one's a simple one, at least on the card it is. It's called Official Officiant. And the question is, who would you want to officiate your memorial service or funeral? Or would you want an officiant?
So my plan is that I'm going to be cremated and that my ashes are going to be scattered in the ocean. So it would be somebody that might lead the ceremony of sorts. I think, to be honest, if I was going to have someone do it, I would probably ask for Gary Pasternak, who is a doctor I worked with for years and years. He's my mentor. He's my friend. I would ask him to speak and to get things started, because he has this gentleness about him that would bring everyone else in and give them some peace during a difficult time. I think I would just have him start. And there's a few friends I have that I would maybe ask to read something, but I'm not going to have a big service.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it would really just be about bringing everyone together. And I never thought about this until just now. So this isn't in my list of wishes. So this is a great question, because I would like him to do that.
That's perfect. So this is why asking those questions and playing those games and using those cards, that's why it's so beneficial. There are things that we haven't thought of before. It stimulates and starts those conversations, helps us to think through those things. And so thank you for being so open in answering something like that. I think it's really important for end-of-life workers to realize that we are the same as everybody else when it comes to advanced care planning. We don't like to have those conversations. It's sad. It's hard. It brings up family dynamics and maybe memories and triggers that we don't want to have to deal with. So those conversations are super important.
I was having dinner with a group of nurses recently and other members of the hospice team. And out of, say, 6 people, myself and only one other had prepared their end-of-life plans.
Say that again. How many?
6. I think 6 or 7 people. There were only 2 of us that had prepared our end-of-life plans. I don't even have an advance directive, but everything else is written down. It's very clear.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the other ones do have that. But no one else has even put anything in writing. They haven't even expressed to their families what they want.
Wow. Well, I'm just as guilty. What I do have is very old. My kids, who are now 31 and 34 and each have children of their own, are going to be under the care of my sister. Because what I have is so old. My kids were much younger back then. They were minors. So it's time for me to take care of that. And I don't really have an advanced care plan as far as my health care and final wishes and disposition and things like that. So it's always a good conversation to have. Absolutely.
I actually have an alarm on my phone to update my plans every 3 months, to change things, just so, because it's all in a computer file. And then I've given the link to my children and everything's in a note of what I want, but I want this document to be updated with any changes. Sometimes I don't have to change anything at all, but sometimes there's other things that I can add or subtract just to make it more current. And I want to make sure that they have everything accessible if that time comes, when that time comes.
You have an alarm in your phone that reminds you to do. That's brilliant.
Otherwise, I wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
Mine's so updated. It has everything. It has where I want to be, what I want, who I want there. It has all the contacts of the people I want notified. I've got letters in my file to give to my family members, so they have something after I've gone, one last thing that I can say to them. I have my playlist already picked out. I'm very, very organized, but I also have all my passwords, and, I have who's in charge of what very little money I have. I have information for my 401k. I mean, everything that they need, they have. And then I also wrote letters giving them permission to have access to everything. I've named them as my decision makers, but I've written down my decisions. but things change. Just a couple things have changed over time, and every 3 months seemed right to me. Sometimes I don't change anything, but yes, I have an alarm so that I go and I take a look and just make sure it's all there. I make sure the link still works.
That is so smart.
Thank you.
I may have to follow your example. I like the fact that you're using tech, that you're using the digital technology and the online technology to organize everything. That's perfect. So smart.
And I have there's a couple really great resources out there to write your plans down, and I've used 3 of them. So I've used the 5 wishes, I've used the mortality workbook, and I've just recently got one that says, I'm dead now, what? And
Yeah.
it's got a cool sugar school on it. And I really like that one just because it's kind of fun. And all of them ask a lot of questions. And like my animals, what do I want to have done with my animal?
Right. What do you want to do with the kitties? Yeah.
The kitties.
Oh, I had not thought about that. So I have a therapy dog that's part of I'm not supposed to say it that way. I am partnered with a therapy dog to be a pet therapy team. He's just turned 5.
Sunny?
Yes. And he's so precious. We volunteer at a hospice agency, but I never have thought about what if something should happen to me. Where do I want Sonny to be? I guess he would be with my husband, but of course he could no longer function as a therapy animal unless another handler were to take him over.
But at least he'd be cared for. I even have a note taped to my light switch that indicates what pets I have and where their boxes are. If something should happen to me in my home and paramedics come in for whatever reason,
Mm-hmm.
the names of the pets and where my boxes are for them.
That way somebody could immediately begin to care for them and make sure they were okay.
Yep.
Oh, maybe that should have been today's topic for your interview. Is advanced care planning, because we can certainly talk about that. We'll have to set that up for next time.
All right, deal.
So we are going to talk about hospice myths and misconceptions because there are a lot of them out there, and they seem to have persisted through the years. And I think that a lot of times end-of-life workers and hospice professionals perpetuate those myths with the things that we do and we say. So the first one we're going to tackle is really good. The myth is hospice is only for the last few days of life. I wish I had a buzzer, because that's not true. So how would you clarify that as a hospice nurse?
Oh boy, I think that people see hospice as a death sentence. And I think what they need to understand is that when you are given 6 months or less to live, you are already dying. And your timing is not necessarily predictable. Even the 6 months can't be predictable, but that's the time frame they use in hospice. What I try to tell people is start hospice that minute you get that diagnosis, because what they can do is address your symptoms if there are symptoms, perhaps work with your medications to see what works and what doesn't, find out what you need, offer you things that you didn't know that were provided for you. Maybe reduce some of your expense, make your person more comfortable, help you to feel a little bit more supported in caring for your person. Oftentimes, we can't change the outcome, but we can change the quality of life at the end of life. And I believe that if you start hospice sooner, you will feel the support in multiple ways. And that can change the difference between pain and peaceful for you and the person who is in that bed navigating this illness. I like to say that hospice is not a diagnosis. It is a plan of care for the diagnosis. Can someone graduate hospice? Yes, if their symptoms are managed and they're not showing signs of decline. Sometimes someone will be off hospice for another year or 2. Does it happen often? No. Sometimes it'll be a couple weeks. I've had people get off hospice and right back on hospice within days. The idea of that, at least from my perspective, is that the family understands that hospice is not the boss of you.
Ooh, I like that. That's one of our other myths that we're busting. Yeah, hospice is not in charge of your life.
And you have options and you have a voice. And we're really just the ones that come in with the resources and the tips and the tools to help you navigate this. But at the end of the day, it's your voice that we hear. It's what you need and want. And yes, I want people to start hospice sooner, not because I want them to die sooner, but because I want their death and dying experience to be a little kinder and a little gentler and perhaps even peaceful, if at all possible.
Well, that is one of the myths, is that you have to have one foot in the grave and the other on the banana peel before hospice is appropriate, which is not true. Hospice as a philosophy, an interdisciplinary approach to care, is designed to help you thrive and improve quality of life in the months and weeks before a death, not just those last few days. And it's really much easier for a hospice team to support a family if that relationship starts earlier.
Absolutely.
Okay, but let's cut back to one of the points that you made. One of the myths that people think is hospice is a diagnosis or a place you go. There are places where you can receive hospice care, but hospice is not a diagnosis. It is a philosophy of care, like oncology is a type of care, but you don't go to oncology to stay when you're getting the treatment. Hospice is a type of care that you can receive if you have a terminal illness or a life-limiting illness, which is a much easier term to understand. But a lot of people do think that hospice is a place. Do you see that misconception quite a bit?
Yes, I think, that's a really good thing that you're saying, because I have experienced family members not wanting to go on hospice because they're thinking that their person will be taken somewhere.
Yeah, that they're going to be taken out of their home.
Yes, and hospice, which people don't realize, some places have a hospice house. Some, you might go to a facility, an assisted living or a board and care. You can have hospice within those.
Yeah, that's just considered your residence.
Right.
Yeah.
And you can have hospice care in the hospital. You can have hospice care in your home or in a friend's home. They don't have to leave your home to receive hospice care. In fact, that's when it's most beneficial because of what is available to you in the home.
Right. But so many people confuse it with being a place, because
Yes.
there are facilities, there are hospice houses, there are freestanding crisis units that we call GIP units that are for hospice. But the majority of our patients, something like 97% of our patients, receive care wherever they call home. And that can be an apartment, a nursing home, a private residence, a halfway house, on the streets, a shelter, that sort of thing, wherever that person calls home. So I think there's a lot of confusion about where you can get hospice. So we definitely want people to know that it is a philosophy of care and not necessarily a place.
That was a good one.
That is a good one. Okay, here's another one that you pitched to me. People die when they start hospice. And I would add, people die because they start hospice.
All right. So they're already dying.
Right.
And I'm not one to mince words, but I think it's really important to know that if someone is declining from age or illness, and it is suggested that they have 6 months or less to live, which we said earlier, they are encouraged to start hospice. You are not going to die sooner. The body knows what to do. And wherever it is in this stage of illness and decline, some people don't have pain. They don't have a whole lot of physical symptoms, but most people do. But even that is not enough to be able to predict when. So if someone comes on hospice and they die shortly after, I take that to mean that their body was ready. I wish they came on sooner.
Right.
But the body knows what to do, and it's going to let go when it's ready. Some hold on for a longer period of time than we hope for, right? We of course, we all want more time, but not like that.
Right.
And so to assume that if your person starts hospice, they're going to die, that's when you have to have the conversation that is realistic and honest and says, they're dying. How can we help you, help them to ensure that their landing is softer and their care is good? That's what hospice does. We don't speed up the process. They people ask why my mom had all these medications. She started hospice and they took her off all her medications and then she died.
Oh,
Those medications were not serving purpose. In fact, in many ways, they were complicating things.
and that's another myth, that hospice
another
will
myth.
automatically take all your medications away from you when you start your care. And that is not true. We do not do that. That is not the way that works.
It is not the way, right? And when you start hospice, your admission nurse will communicate with the doctor after going through all of your medications and have the doctor review them, right? To figure out which ones are not serving purpose anymore.
Right.
The other thing that people don't realize is that the hospice benefit covers most medications that align with the illness, the diagnosis, and the symptoms related to that.
Right.
So if you're having medications that probably aren't serving purpose and you're paying out of pocket, we want to reduce that expense for you. If they're not serving purpose, they're not needed. And if your person is struggling with swallowing, why give them more things to swallow? Why put out more money for something that is not bringing comfort? Sometimes you might be taking a medication that is not covered under hospice, and the doctor might look at it and say, we have something similar. We're just going to change the medication so it can be covered under the hospice benefit. But we don't stop the medications as some sort of, and I don't want to use the word punishment, but it's like, oh, you're on hospice now, so now you have to you can't take any of these medications anymore.
Right. We don't care about what's happening or what's going on with you. We're just going to
You're going to die anyway. You don't need them.
Exactly.
That is not the mindset.
No.
The mindset is you don't need these. They're not serving you or your body any purpose at this time. They're ridiculously expensive. We don't want you to absorb that cost. We also want to make things easier for your person and limit what they have to do each day.
Right.
And if there are medications that we think you should stay on, we're going to cover those. And if we can't, we'll be honest with you about that. Perhaps, again, like I said, we'll find something else that aligns with that is under the formulary.
Right. And there are other ways to get meds paid for.
Yes. And
Right.
we'll help research that as well. Hospice is not in the business of taking steps to speed up the process. What we're in the business of doing is making sure that however long this takes, that your person is cared for well, and that we reduce symptoms, some of which could come from medications that you're currently taking.
That's true. I think the biggest point to put an accent on there is that hospice never accelerates death. We don't postpone it. We support you while your body does its work that it knows how to do to shut itself off. This conversation is so good, but we're going to take a quick break. Hang on for more great content.
This episode is being sponsored by Care Boss, the latest book by Jennifer O'Brien. More than 54 million Americans are serving as unpaid caregivers for family members, friends, or neighbors with serious illnesses. Very few have received the training, guidance, or emotional support they need to succeed in this role. Care Boss, the newest book by healthcare leader Jennifer O'Brien, fills this need by identifying and empowering the family caregiver as the leadership position it is. Jennifer shares her motivation for writing Care Boss.
I wrote Care Boss because I have been a serial family caregiver and I have been a serial CEO in healthcare. And it occurred to me that the family caregiver position is indeed a leadership position. I would go so far as to say it is a leadership position of greater importance than the CEO of a Fortune 500 company because this is your person.
Jennifer writes with compassion and hard-earned wisdom. Readers will appreciate the empowerment and camaraderie they find in the pages of Care Boss. Care Boss is more than just a book. It's a workbook and organizer that enables family caregivers to lead their loved ones' care sensitively and effectively. You can find Care Boss at your local indie bookstore or on Amazon and at jenniferaobrien.com.
Let's talk about morphine, because so many people are afraid of morphine, and that's a huge myth when it comes to hospice, that they're going to give you morphine and you're going to die immediately. Well, first thing to know is not everybody gets morphine, because not everybody needs it. And the second thing I would say is you always have the right to refuse any medication, or the person who's speaking for you has the right to refuse that. What type of education do you provide around morphine when you're working with a family?
This is a great topic because it is the one that people struggle with most. When you start hospice, the hospice will send over a bag, a kit of medications. They're usually similar to morphine, lorazepam, Ativan type medications. Now they're sending them to you so that they are in the home.
Right.
In the event a symptom arises that there are no other medications that can, help with that. And that way our triage, our nurse that arrives to support you, they have something to work with. Some people use all of them. Some people use none of them. It's just in the house so that we know it's there in case it's needed. The initial order, which is a PRN as needed order, unless the doctor has created an order that they need to take it scheduled, let's say for morphine example, is usually a very small amount, usually about 1/4 of a 1 milliliter syringe. It is not enough to end a life. The body reacts differently to medications. So you never know how someone's going to react. Some they'll take that little bit amount and it works great, no pain for hours. Some that it doesn't help them at all. Some have the opposite effect. So when we give medications, we base it on how it's working for that person. We try it out. We give a little amount. Then we see how that's doing. We either pull back or we give more. But even if we doubled the 1/4 of a syringe, it's not enough to end a life. The way I explain it to families is that when someone, for instance, is suffering with pain or shortness of breath, which morphine really addresses beautifully most of the time, when morphine is given, it's as though it goes directly to those areas and allows the body to just relax and succumb to what it was already doing, but with a little less pain.
Right.
Did they die from the medication? No. Could they die after taking it? Yes, but here's why. Because the pain was at this level that was unbearable. The medication was given. It reduced the pain. The body was not fighting as hard, and therefore it gave in to what it was trying to do.
Right.
So what people need to understand is that we do not give enough medications to end a life. The medications are there to reduce the symptoms that are causing suffering at the end of life. Your person is already going through the decline and the dying stage. And this is all part of the process. And sometimes there's pain, and sometimes there's shortness of breath and agitation and delirium and confusion. All of these are things that could and often happen at the end of life. And we have the medications that address it in such a way that it reduces not just the symptom itself, but the agitation and the anxiety that the body has reacting to all of that suffering.
Right. And that's what a comfort pack is for, the bag that you're talking about. Yes, those medicines are for those, the big boogers that we deal with when it comes to symptom management, shortness of breath, pain, things like that. But morphine has such a bad rap.
It has a negative connotation to the name.
Yeah. I mean, I get it, right? When my father-in-law was actively dying towards the end of his life, he'd had a stroke, but he had end-stage Alzheimer's and was on hospice. We needed to bump up the dose of his med, and it was within the parameters that the hospice nurse had given. She said, here's where he is now, but you can increase it if you needed to. And he was panting to breathe. And so I brought that up. I said, he probably needs a higher dose, but the family didn't want to give it. They asked me to do it. And just because I was there and I was familiar with morphine. And so after I gave him the dose, he got comfortable. It was fine. Breathing was much more relaxed. He went from like 36 a minute down to 20, which is much more comfortable. But I left there, and afterwards I thought, on my way home, what if he dies after I give him this dose? Are they going to blame me and think that somehow I killed him? Which I think is a very common thought process that caregivers go through. So if you're an end-of-life worker and you're listening to this, it's always good to understand the thought processes and the rationales that your clients, your families, and your patients have when it comes to what you're doing. It is a reasonable fear, and we should never invalidate that or disregard it.
That's why I always say, I add the part about, is it enough to end a life? No.
Mm-hmm.
Could they die after? Yes.
Yes.
Because people need to know. But, that's not the only thing that people have the myth or misconception about morphine. It's the addiction too.
Yes.
I think people are very afraid of that. And I've seen people, nurses especially, often just roll their eyes. That's not going to happen. He's dying anyway. Why are you worrying about that?
Oh,
That's not my mindset. My mindset is clearly there's a fear here for whatever reason. Perhaps this person had an addiction. Perhaps they had an addiction. Maybe there's history in the family. I think you need to address that honestly and carefully and compassionately and say, I can appreciate how you're feeling. And I will work with them. I'll say, look, let's do this. Your person maybe has hours to days. I believe that his body is shutting down and he is dying. These medications are going to bring him comfort. If something changes, if he should rally or become more alert or time seems to be extended for whatever reason, and there is any concern for addiction, I promise you we will address that. But at this time, at this stage, and what they're going through right now, that's not a concern. I am not worried about that. And I promise you, I will not let that happen. Let's just deal with right now. But to roll eyes or dismiss or not truly honor that person's fear exacerbates their fear.
Absolutely.
And they're going to think something is going to happen, either that their person is going to die because you gave morphine, or they are going to become addicted. We have to honor the person's fear, whether it's the person in the bed or those at the bedside, and especially those at the bedside, because years down the road, when they're still continuing their grief journey, that little thing, that tiny moment in time is going to be so deeply embedded in their head, and they're going to constantly think that either they killed their person or they maybe encourage them to be addicted to the medications. Yeah. And we have to remove that for them.
Yeah, it's important to recognize that and to support them as they work through that and educate. I remember studying and reading the science, and it's been a long time, but I want to say that if morphine is truly used, opioids are truly used for pain management that is legitimate, there's like a less than 1% risk of addiction. But this whole thing where, we say, well, this person is dying anyway, it doesn't matter. It always matters.
It always matters.
We should always be listening to patients and caregivers and the concerns that they have. That's our job. That is our job to do that. Oof. The other thing I want to say about morphine is that, morphine may be brought into the house in case it's needed. If it's never needed, that's great too. There are some patients who choose not to take opioids even though they might need it. And I think it's good to mention here, since we're talking about morphine, that is okay too. There are cultures and mindsets and life experiences. Person's had 30 years of sobriety and does not want to use an opioid, a narcotic, or they have a belief system or a culture where to suffer is part of cleansing during the death experience, during the dying experience. We never want to take that away from anyone. We are called to respect that. So if morphine is needed, but it is chosen that it not be used, that is the patient's right to do that.
Absolutely. And I respect that too. I'm going to be super straight up in that there are times where I will say to the family, can I just share with you the benefits of this? I understand where you're coming from and I
Right.
respect that, but I do feel that he is suffering and it is in my nature to reduce that. And I believe this would work. Would you please allow me to try it? And if they still say no, then I'm going to give them a whole bunch of other tactile and verbal ways of stimuli that can reduce some of the symptoms. I'm going to do
Right.
positioning and I'm going to do cool washcloths and I'm going to, massage the feet or aromatherapy or something else to help reduce it. Is it enough? Often no, but they have to make peace with the decisions that they make for someone they love. And I'm not going to go and mess that up for them. But I will advocate for the patient.
The patient and the caregiver are going to decide whether the intervention is effective and whether it's enough.
Yes.
So we offer everything we can, which is what your hospice nurse is supposed to do, right? We offer all the education, we offer all the resources and the supports, every weapon we have in our arsenal, every tool in the tool belt. They pick and choose what they want. And they get to decide whether it's effective, whether that's good enough for them. Pain is always what the patient says it is. So it's just hard for hospice people to accept that sometimes because we know what works, but patients and caregivers are the experts in their own care.
And this is not about us. And we do go into their home, into their space with all these tools and this education and knowledge and history and end-of-life care. But at the end of the day, their experience isn't about us. And we should never take it upon ourselves to insult, dismiss, or change their mindset. If we can offer more education to help them make peace with possibly giving medication, I do support that. But at the end of the day, if they say no, I say, okay.
Right. That's the way it
because
works.
That's how it should be. It's not about us.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we're not the boss of them.
I love that. I'm not the boss of you.
Not the boss of them.
True. Okay. We're going to get close to time in a few minutes, and we have so many myths that we wanted to get through. But so here's a big one, and you had sent this to me, and I think it's super important. The myth is that hospice will provide caregivers like aides and nurses that will stay all day or come every day.
Yeah, that's a big one.
I need my buzzer for that one, don't I? Zzz.
So the first one is hospice does not provide caregivers.
No.
What hospice provides is a social worker with a lot of resources to help you find a caregiver and ways to help, find a reduction in costs and what's available to you as far as that, because caregivers can add up, especially if you're needing one 24/7.
Sure.
But hospice does not provide a caregiver. Hospice does provide a home health aide, which can come anywhere from 1 to 5, sometimes more times a week, to do bathing, to change the linens, change the clothing, and put the person in the shower or do a bath in the bed. They're usually only there for an hour, 2 at most.
Right.
And that is all they do. They don't do laundry. They don't clean the house. They don't do anything they don't prepare meals. They address the cleanliness and care of the person in the bed,
Right.
but that is their only role. Now, as far as nurses generally, when you first start hospice, depending on what your symptoms are, you will see a nurse, your case manager, once a week. If there are symptoms and they need to be seen more, you might see other nurses as well as your case manager, just depending on where they are on this journey. It could be that they're actively dying and a nurse will come every day. If they're having wound care that needs to be done 2 or 3 times a week, you'll have a nurse that comes that many times to do that, or a Pleurex draining or something along those lines, then you'll see the nurse more frequently. It really is about symptom management. There's a thing called continuous care. When a patient is having a lot of symptoms that cannot be managed by their caregiver, their family member, and maybe they're needing medication given around the clock, or they're needing somebody at their bedside 24/7 because there isn't anyone there. Hospice does offer continuous care where a nurse would be there. But if the symptoms are reduced, the nurse leaves. So it is only if symptoms need to be managed. And And it's usually in bouts of 4 to 8 hours, I believe. I think it's 8 hours.
Yeah, it's very badly named because the hours don't have to be continuous. It's a little complicated on the regulatory side for the hospice agency. And of course, that's not the patient and the family member's issue to have to deal with. The hospice is responsible for that. But I think the fact that they call it continuous care is misleading. Because it doesn't mean we're going to be there 24/7 for an entire week. It is chunks of hours. It can't be less than 4 hours or we don't get paid. And also, not all of it's provided by a nurse. 50% of it has to be provided by a nurse. The other 50% of it can be an aide. But when you're talking about medication administration that might need to be frequent to manage symptoms, an aide can't do that. So it's a little confusing. And I do think that people see that written on a hospice website and they think, oh, they're going to be there around the clock. When in fact, there's no hospice agency that's set up to provide care like that. That isn't what we do.
That's not what we do. And actually a good example, I was with a family the other day and the woman said, my sister's brother's wife, I can't remember how it broke down, but she said she had a nurse every day and the nurse was there for several hours. And I said, okay, first of all, did they have a lot of symptoms? The first day, yes. And I said, did they hire a private duty nurse come in? Oh, I don't know. You can do that.
Yes.
You can have a private duty nurse come in and she can be here however long you hire them. But that's not how hospice works. But her mindset was, oh, good. And it was the same with caregiver. It was her husband who was the patient. And she said that she was expecting a caregiver full-time to start right away and to have the nurse there every day. And I was managing his symptoms. I said, his symptoms do not qualify to have continuous care. And I explained to her what continuous care was.
Right.
But she then looked into a private duty nurse, and I believe that she hired one. But there is enough wrong information to create misconceptions. And we have to be clear.
If you're the caregiver and you're swimming, you're drowning in caregiver responsibilities, and somebody gives you the perception that there's caregiving support that will mean more boots on the ground at the bedside, man, wouldn't you take them up on that offer?
Absolutely.
For sure.
And then when you don't get that, you feel let down. And you feel like, why did I even do this in the first place? I don't need hospice. They're not providing me with what I need. So that's where we have to educate and say, but this is what we can provide you.
Right.
And it really does start with support. It's that each member of the team bringing something to the situation that offers the resources, the tips, the tools, the education in a way that makes you feel supported. And I want people to trust that.
So that leads us to our next one. That's the perfect segue for our last myth. So everybody on the interdisciplinary team that is part of hospice is a really important part of the care of a patient and the family caregivers. But the myth is, if there's a hospice team in place, there's no need for an end-of-life doula, or vice versa, if there is a doula, there is no need for a hospice team. That's a myth, and we want to really highlight that because you are not just a hospice nurse, you are also an end-of-life doula. You bring some duality of skills, both very important. What do you tell your families and your patients about utilizing an end-of-life doula when you're working as a hospice nurse?
One of the things that I always start out with is explaining each member of the hospice team and the benefits each one brings in, which includes the social worker and chaplain, which are often people will say, oh, I don't need that. And I'll say, but yes, you do. The other thing that's really important to know is that we are not a solo act. Even if I come into a situation where there might be some drama or disconnect and I need to help that doesn't make me a social worker. I might help in that moment, but I will call the social worker to help finish that off because I know my role and I stay in my lane. Sometimes we have to wear different hats, But at the end of the day, the hospice team collaboratively works together to ensure that the patient and the family are cared for and supported well. We need that in place. The difference between the hospice team and an end-of-life doula is that the end-of-life doula has the luxury of time. We can only stay for a short amount of time, usually an hour, because we're off to the next patient. I wish we could stay longer. It doesn't work that way.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Yes. The end-of-life doula is also a benefit, but the end-of-life doula is not a replacement for any member of the team. The doula is also out of pocket, so it is not covered under hospice like the other members of the team. Can we all work together well? Yes, but it is important to stay in your lane and to know your role and to better educate the families to know how you can use us all collectively. A doula is wonderful because they do have the luxury of time. They can also help personalize your end-of-life plan and really support you on that journey and hold your hand a little bit longer. They can stay at the bedside longer. There's a lot that they can do that really benefits. I encourage families to have both. But it's really important that the doula also stays in her lane. Now, as a nurse, right, I'm a nurse and a doula. I can't go into a home as a doula and wear my nurse hat. It is very hard to do. So this isn't easy for someone who has filled those other shoes. But I know that as a doula, that's not my role. So as a doula, when I'm with a family, I use my nursing skills to assess a situation, knowing when a member of the hospice team is needed. And I will say to the family member, you need to call your hospice team now. You need to reach out to your social worker. You need to talk to the chaplain. You need to see about your home health aide or a volunteer. They're not the same thing. The hospice team is a group of individuals that come together to support and manage symptoms and care at the end of life. The doula is an addition to the support of the family and the patient, but will not replace any member of the team. And I think it's also important that the hospice team respects the doula and that the doula respects the hospice team, because I have been there as a doula where the hospice team has completely ignored me. The minute I said, oh, I'm also a hospice nurse, because I wanted to get their attention, then they treated me with more respect. That bothers me too, because the doula is truly coming from this beautiful, compassionate, heart-centered place, trying to be there for both the person in the bed and the people who love them, understanding the true meaning of presence. It's a benefit to have both, but one does not replace the other.
I think that is the most important thing to remember. It's important to have both, and one doesn't replace the other. And I would say that for every discipline across the board when it comes to a hospice team. And hospice teams often include end-of-life doulas.
Yes.
Yes.
But how they do that, though, is that they train their hospice volunteers to be doulas.
Right.
And actually, I mean, you and I will agree on this. Hospice volunteers are doulas in my mind.
Yeah,
right?
they are in a way, but they are untrained, so they don't have that particular designation.
Correct. Unless they are.
Unless they are. Hospice is complicated sometimes. It's messy, right? And we know this, but we also know that having support for those who are dying and for those who care for the dying in the home is so important. Hospice is still the best way to get that support. I still believe that.
I would actually, if I was to give advice to a family, if there wasn't a time of 6 months or less, right, then I would say start with a doula. Let them help, because doulas can start whenever they want. There's no time frame. But when there is a determination that it could be 6 months or less to live, I would say start hospice right away, because the benefits are worth it, and incorporate the doula as well, because they can work together beautifully. And it's another pair of eyes on your person. It's another hand holding yours. Yeah. None of this is a bad thing. We just have to remember the roles and the respect of the roles.
Yeah. It's just another person in your caregiving village. So
Yes.
important. Gabby, the Hospice Heart, how can my listeners find you, connect with your classes, and connect in with you on social media?
Actually, you can just go to my website, thehospiceheart.net. Everything is there. The link to the Hospice Heart Community Facebook page, my classes, my blogs, my books and podcasts like this one will be on there. And really, you can find everything there.
I will have links in the show notes so that people can go and find you. Thank you so much for joining me again today. It was great to have you back.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Heart of Hospice podcast. Check out our sponsor in the show notes and please leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. We would appreciate it if you would share this episode with your friends and family and anyone who needs to know more about hospice. Connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, no matter who you are or where you are in your hospice journey, you are the heart of hospice.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time.